sudden arrival of COVID-19, an escalating Sino-U.S. rivalry, and the ever-present specter of climate change. All puzzles require the wisdom of international organizations like the United Nations. But how might the organization solve them? To pick the brain, as it were, of a key UN figure on these issues, I'm joined by Mr. Liu Zhenmin, Under-Secretary General of the UN at the 2021 Boao Forum for Asia in Hainan. That's our topic. I'm Zhou Yue. Under-Secretary General, I know that you've been looking at the changes over Boao, and you came here several times. And today's theme is also the world in change. But in your opinion, what is the biggest change happened in this world?
Since the outbreak of the pandemic more than a year ago, the world suffered a shock. Almost all countries had locked down. That's why until now, I think the international traffic has been very difficult. Just with the limited connections with the international flights. With the vaccination applied in most of the countries, world also start to recover. But it will take a very long time to recover fully. Over the past year, we have been stay-at-home telecommuting for all the meetings, all the events.
You mean all the UN events?
All the UN events.
Adapted to the change?
Yes.
UN's work has also suffered because of the COVID?
We have suffered a lot because first, we have to defer most of our meetings, conferences planned for 2020 to the future, to 2021, to 2022. For those meetings planned to be convened in New York at headquarters, we have to convene all these meetings virtually. We've
been talking about a lot of the global governance at the Boao Forum.
Yeah.
And this year's actually Boao Forum is to strengthen global governance. However, what we have seen in many countries is their politics have turned inward and domestically inclined.
Yeah.
As a UN official, how do you look at global governance right now?
Global response to this pandemic has been rather slow due to the lack of international coordination of action. So in the process, I think the United Nations, World Health Organization, and other organizations had done the best to coordinate. But for most of the actions in the country, also depending on the governments, both central governments and the local governments, to coordinate. So you can see after a year, for those countries, they have a better governance, better coordination, national coordination, local coordination. I think their progress in the containment of virus, it's much better than others. But that also reveals that both the issue of global governance and the national governance of many countries. I think one thing we need to learn from this pandemic global governance requires improvement. Multilateralism is essential. The so-called populism or nationalism is not good for the national governance. When the world preparing for the post-COVID world or post-COVID era, the governance will be one of the top priority issues for all countries.
But the contradiction is that many national politics has become nationalistic and isolationist, as you say. But the global governance is definitely in short deficit, especially in the time of COVID, which ignores national borders. How can you reconcile national politics going nationalistic, but international cooperation is in great demand?
What we find gradually over the past months, I think there are also improvements in some countries, like in North America and in Europe. There used to be, very nationalist governments and very, very populist movements in many of the countries. So that affected both the global coordination as well as the coordination in some regional groups, like European Union. European Union used to be a very efficient regional organization, but also in early days also responded not so efficient because of internal coordination.
Is it because the COVID shock is too big for any governments to handle?
Nobody prepared. No country is prepared. Then that's why I think it's caused a lot of problem for many governments to coordinate among themselves and with its own people. Lack of coordination means there be lack of governance. So that's why I think for both for the UN and for the member states, we are going to advocate to improve governance.
But the world is on the road to recovery as vaccination rolled out. But going down the road, what do you make of the challenges faced by humanity in this recovery process?
The recovery will take for a few years.
A few years?
A few years. I think luckily, the major economies start to recover. That's from East Asia, from Europe and North America. That gradually there'll be a recovery. So for 2021, in the early of the year, our projection there will be a 4.7% growth.
You mean
globally?
Globally.
Globally. Of course, for East Asia, we have a much better, I think, projection. The new administration of the U.S. for the stimulus plans, I think there'll be the projection also have been improved. So generally, I think there'll be the better recovery for the major economies. But in this world, I think now we should see the recovery in both ways, not just see the global GDP growth. We also see what about the rest of the world, the developing countries, because for many developing countries, they are, especially for those countries depending on a single industry, like for depending on tourism.
Like Thailand?
No, Thailand, even these island countries, Caribbean countries, Pacific countries, island countries, like our Maldives.
Maldives.
Yeah. They are entirely depending on tourism. But tourism entirely stopped. And it will take for years to recover fully. Like for those countries, for commodity exporting countries, I think the global chain for export has also affected. For those manufacturing countries, I think because of the consumption, global consumption was not recovered. So it will take for a few years to recover. At the same time, I think for the United Nations, we are encouraging member states to not see just your growth rate. You also see what about your employment rate. Because most severe shock of this crisis would be many people got unemployed. For last year alone, more than 200 million full-time jobs lost.
But will they be able to get back as soon as COVID is over?
No, I think some jobs have gone forever because there'll be new technologies, new ways of working, new lifestyle will replace all these old jobs. But for those jobs, because there used to be provided, this service provided by low income, low skill workers, local workers.
So those workers will not find their old jobs.
It's difficult for them to find their jobs for a few years. So that's why I think employment, we need for government to see both economic growth, GDP growth, and the employment rate simultaneously. That's why I think for the Chinese government, they have a strategy. We see they always evaluate and assess their progress both for the economic growth and as well as the employment growth.
So vaccination is another concern for the whole world, because different countries are going ahead with different pace, covering different percentages of the population.
Yeah.
What kind of problems would that create?
Globally, to contain this pandemic, vaccination becoming fundamental. because no real effective medicine to cure this virus. So vaccination becomes fundamental, and there's a projection that until human beings, global human beings, they require to be over 70 to 80% of the vaccination rate to ensure that there be herd immunity will prevail. But you are right. I think the vaccination progress has been really too slow. One thing I think has been worried by my Secretary General Antonio Guterres until now, the vaccines have been really almost monopoly by these developed countries and countries for manufacturing vaccines. So there's the issue that be how to ensure that global South have access to the vaccines. So that's why I think it will take really also a few years, because for 2021, most probably Europe, North America, and a part of East Asia will have a high percentage of vaccination rate. But other regions, they are still waiting. It means that the global vaccination will take we should have to wait for another year. So, but challenge that there's a slogan that nobody will be safe unless everybody is safe. It means that if one country or one region not vaccinated, this world will not be able to open entirely. So that will be trouble. That's why I think for the United Nations, for the World Health Organization, we have been doing our best to advocate the international cooperation in the vaccination campaign.
But the problem is, are UN and WHO doing enough? Because although Antonio Guterres and WHO chief have been saying there is inequality in the world of vaccinations, still many developed countries refuse to help those in greater need of vaccines. Vaccine nationalism still exists.
Yes, that's true. But challenge for Secretary Antonio Guterres and also for Director General Tedros of WHO, they have no resources. They have no resources. So for every action, they need to consult and negotiate with the governments. So that's why I think it'll be only when those governments in Europe and in North America, they have almost completed their national vaccination, they'll be prepared to help others.
So the world has to wait.
This will be a tragedy. But that's why I think globally, the rest of the world will have to wait. Yeah. But that's why I think the Secretary General Antonio Guterres advocating the idea that he had to be every government, especially the major economies, should take vaccination as a global public good. This is not the product for making money, but this is a global public good for help each other, for help the global community.
And China has also played its part there, because China has basically contained the virus within this border and has its own versions of vaccine and is sending vaccines to other parts of the world. How do you look at China's role there?
China's support to other countries has been highly appreciated. But of course, China has a huge responsibility to speed up its own vaccination campaign nationally. Because China remains is the largest population in the world. So if China is going to want to open the borders and think to others, they have to complete the vaccination to majority of the population. So this also depending how much progress this vaccination campaign in the coming months. I think if when China, its national vaccination campaign achieved good progress, they would be prepared to help others in the coming months. So it's the vaccination in the hands of group of countries, either from the research, development, and manufacturing. For the international organization like UN and the World Health Organization, and even the World Intellectual Property Organization, need to discuss that protecting the patent and the intellectual property rights. They need to encourage that vaccination should be provided to developing countries to be free of charge.
But I think those big pharma companies are resisting that kind of change, because that means they will suffer some financial losses.
Pharmaceutical companies, they should pay for the investment. Definitely, they should be encouraged and they should be paid. But for many countries, including China, the vaccination provided to the public free of charge is by the government
should
budget.
foot the bill.
Yeah.
You earlier mentioned border opening. I think this is also an important issue for the whole world. When and how to open the border if vaccination is not complete. China is also making the same call at the moment. What is your thinking?
For the United Nations, I think we are trying to appeal all governments to do all necessary measures, take all necessary measures to open the border with kind of regulation. That's why in the forthcoming October, we are going to convene in cooperation with the Chinese government. We are going to convene the second United Nations Global Sustainable Transport Conference in Beijing. One of the objectives for this conference, we are going to advocate that sustainable transport should be shared by all countries, and transport should be reopened. International transport should be opened for as far as possible, because in a globalized economy, unless international transport is available, there'll be no real global cooperation.
But how can you convince a country who has contained the virus to open the border without the full vaccination?
People should change the mentality. This working style, lifestyle will not go back to normal prior to this COVID-19. So they have to find new ways, because the reopening the border and for the new regulation for the containment also require more additional budget. But for most governments, they are not so prepared for that. I think like wearing masks, it doesn't mean that you had a vaccination, you are entirely safe. In some circumstances, you may also be required to wear your masks. This is a cheap and essential way for protecting yourself.
Let's talk about major economies. They've been taking some headlines. I know a recent UN report that you also participated, saying that the poorest countries have actually been hit the hardest, and that could push the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDG, back 10 years. So if the postponement of that goal happened, what does it mean for the world, especially for the poor countries?
The poor countries has been hit the hardest. Well, as I mentioned, for those LDC countries, over 46 LDC countries, the least developed countries, and these small island developing countries, really they have hit the hardest. Recovery for them would take for more than
a few years. A decade?
Not really, because their recovery will not depend on themselves. Their recovery depends on the rest of the world.
Okay.
Yeah, That's why I think the world should be prepared to help them, to support them. So that's why I think for this world, the major economies still have responsibility to lead the world recovery, world economic recovery. At the same time, they should be prepared to help others.
So they should give back to the rest of the world?
Not really get back. I think for this world, it'd be really economically, because the principle for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was adopted by world leaders in 2015, principle to leave no one behind. It means that we need to help every poor country, every poor group, and every poor individual. So this is the kind of guiding principle for the United Nations and for the world. So that's why I have advocated for the full recovery of the world economy. We should not just focusing on whether the major economies or the global economic rate has been recovered or not. We also see we need to focus what about the rest of developing countries? If their economy not recovered, we cannot see this world recovered.
But still, the major economies will take the lead and serve as the locomotives.
Yes.
But there are problems. For example, the U.S.-China rivalry in many different fields, security and economic areas. As a UN official, how do you look at the number one and number two economies in the world competing in such a way, some say fiercest competition ever?
Actually, I think the competition existing mainly for political reasons. Economically speaking, it's be more cooperation than competition. You can see even last year, the world has experienced the historical confrontation between the two major economies. But if we see by the end of the year of 2020, the China-U.S. trade increased. If you're going to talk about with the U.S. companies, U.S. businessmen, they still see China has been very potential and a prosperous market. And they are as an important partner for future cooperation. So that's why I think the world, for the entire world, they're expecting that these two major economies will see each other as partners. But we can see the recent development is not bad, especially with this China-U.S. This joint working group on climate change. I think their recent meeting in Shanghai, including the release of a joint statement, it sent a very positive signal that even major economies, major rivalries can cooperate. So that's why I think this is both a lesson and experience. For the United Nations, I think Secretary General Antonio Guterres he has reached out to both leaders of both countries and encouraged them to cooperate, because their cooperation will determine the world more positively.
But if the geopolitical tension is still there, a lot of our businesses and also private people will have a hard time planning for the future because a lot of things are uncertain. That is not good for economic growth or personal development. How do you suggest them to do?
At this moment, when the world preparing for the post-COVID world, it's not just the issue of economic recovery. The world also needs to be prepared to be how the future world will be governed and regulated. That's why it will require to be better cooperation among the major powers. Gradually, the major countries also will realize that global issues will require global action, like climate change. If the world do nothing in the coming decade, definitely we are going to confront climate catastrophe after 30 years.
So that's a common challenge faced by humanity.
Yeah.
And there are
Even climate change and this global public health. This pandemic will be unprecedented historical one, but will not be the last one.
You mentioned two challenges. Some say it's a double whammy coming at the same time.
Yeah.
What kind of a policy should national governments and international organizations put forward?
For the year 2021, for the United Nations, we're advocating three priorities. Number one, global vaccination. Yes. Advocate support global vaccination. Second, promoting global economic recovery with the support of investment in developing countries. Third, is to use this opportunity for recovery to make better use of the renewable energy, addressing the climate change. So these three priorities will be fundamental for all countries and for the world, at least for 2021. It might be priority for 2022 again.
Earlier you mentioned China and the U.S. are coming together again for climate talk. Ahead of the Glasgow COP26, is there any chances of making new commitment and breakthroughs?
For the United Nations, I think our objective we use the COP26 to be coming in Glasgow in November to consolidate the international consensus for their actions before 2030. It means when governments are going to submit their nationally determined contributions by 2030, they should be ambitious, really, to accomplish their Paris Agreement commitment. Second, our objective also to establish kind of an international coalition for the support of carbon neutrality by 2050. So that's already good momentum with European Union members, with China, with Japan and Korea. A number of major economies are announced they'll be prepared for carbon neutrality by 2050. Of course, China announced by 2060. So I think on the climate change issue, there could be very good progress. Even as for our Global Sustainable Transport Conference, I mentioned to be convened in Beijing, one of the objectives for the transport conference also to help to reduce the emissions, carbon emissions from the transport sector. Because until now, the emissions for transport sector also account for 23 to 25%. But there's a great potential to reduce.
Looking ahead, will 2021 be a better year than 2020?
Definitely. Economically, I think it'll be a much better year. Last year, we suffered a global contraction of around 4.3%, except a few countries like China, they had a positive growth. But for 2021, globally, with new policy measures in some major economies, like including U.S., I think projection will be much better. Even the global projection for the Chinese economy will be much better in 2021.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much, Undersecretary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.